Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm so excited to have with us today Robert Louis Brandon Edwards, and today we're going to be discussing the Great Migration and the Road to Freedom. Before we get started, I just wanted to go over a couple quick housekeeping items with everyone today. First off, you'll be receiving a copy of this webinar in your email tomorrow. Just so look around 1, 2 o'clock tomorrow afternoon, and that should be arriving to you. Also, if you have any issues with your webinar software today, just close out the link, re-click the link that was sent to you. That should solve 99% of your problems. And likewise, if you're on the phone, same sort of deal, hang up, call back in again. We also have AIA credit for this webinar. So if anyone on the call is looking for AIA credit, I'm about to send that out in the chat box. So just click that link, fill out the information so you can receive the credit for that. And I have the great pleasure of introducing Robert with us today. Robert Louis Brandon Edwards is an artist, historian, and preservationist. He works on focuses on excuse me. His work focuses on the experiences of Black mobility in America and its relationship to place. He received a Bachelor of Architecture degree from the State University of New York and a Master's of Architectural History with a certificate in Historic Preservation from the University of Virginia. He is currently a PhD student in historic preservation at Columbia University, a scholar in residence at Voices Underground, and a fellow of both Widen the Circle and the Society of American Architectural Historians. So without further ado, I'll turn things over to Robert, and he's having some camera trouble right now. So if you see a giant black box, that's going to be Robert for a while. I'm going to disappear for a little bit so we can focus on what Robert's saying in his presentation, and we'll take questions at the end of the presentation. So if you have any questions as the presentation goes on, just please type them into the Q&A box, and we'll get those answered once Robert finishes his presentation. Thank you. I'll turn things over to Robert now.
Thanks, Devin. Thanks, everyone. I promises this is me presenting this. I'll share my screen here. So before I begin, I actually want to thank Heritage Ohio for hosting this conversation. I also want to thank them for creating a space to even have these types of conversations. And I also want to thank you guys for joining us today. I want to share my deepest gratitude for you guys being here. So I want to start by, let's see, by asking this question. What comes to mind when you think of the Great Migration? You don't have to answer this in the chat unless you really want to. But I just want to get you thinking about this question. What comes to mind when you hear Great Migration? What's your relationship to the Great Migration? As I present my work to you guys. But many of us think about place, and that place could be Harlem, could be Detroit, Chicago, Cleveland. Um, and while these places are super important to the Great Migration or to the story of the Great Migration, my research focuses on the journey of the Great Migration. And just to be clear, the Great Migration was a period that occurred between 1910 and 1970. The first wave of the Great Migration was from 1910 to 1940, and the second wave was between 1940 and 1970. And that's when millions of African Americans fled southern states for cities in the Northwest and Midwest to escape overt acts of racial discrimination and violence, and of course, to obtain better opportunities such as jobs, education, and healthcare. So I am really focusing on the journeys of the Great Migration, and I'll be talking about a bus, the Greyhound bus that I purchased. But a lot of people who research the Great Migration have focused on um, people traveling by trains, as depicted by Walter Ellison and Jacob Lawrence in these paintings. But that was the first wave of the Great Migration. During the second wave of the Great Migration, when people migrated, they usually traveled by car or by bus, and that was because of the development of the highway system. This is a photograph of my grandmother, my mother, and my aunt. Um, and this is they are my relationship to the Great Migration. This is why I'm connected. I am a product of the Great Migration. My family is originally from Fredericksburg, Virginia. And so their Great Migration story starts here in this place. This was where my great grandmother's house used to be, on this plot of land. And you can still see where their water pump was for their house, off to the side there. And so this house was demolished before I was born, so I never got to see it. It was where my grandmother was raised. It was where my mother and aunt were raised. And I would pass it on our way to our newer house, or the house that I'm familiar with, my childhood home, in Fredericksburg. And I would try to imagine it, but I couldn't quite imagine the space that they would talk about leaving to go to New York City. And so last year, I had my mother and my aunt draw from memory what the house looked like. My mother is Linda. She's the shorter curl, on the left. My aunt is, on the right. And they drew the house that they grew up in from memory. And so this exercise of getting them to draw this house from memory was my way of preserving their childhood home, but also preserving this space so that I could know and learn, where I come from and what they migrated from. And so in this house, which was my great grandmother's house, my grandmother shared a bed with her two girls, in one bedroom, and my great grandmother slept in the other bedroom. And you can see this wasn't, a large space. And so my grandmother is sharing this house with her mother in a bed with her two girls. And she's working at the Sylvania cellophane plant factory down the road. She's also working at a segregated diner, um, where she has to enter in through the back of the diner just to get to work. And so there's not a lot of room for upward mobility, in the South for an African American woman, especially one with two small girls that she has to provide for. And she's also in this town called Fredericksburg, where there are overt symbols and icons of racism. There's segregated spaces, there's, um, roads, highways, neighborhoods named after Confederate soldiers. There's a slave auction block on the corner, to remind Black people, of their place in the South. And so she packs up, my mother and my aunt, and they head to this Greyhound bus depot on Princess Anne and Wolf Streets, downtown, um, saving up money for tickets to catch a Greyhound bus to New York City, a place that she hadn't been, but learned about it from, other relatives who had migrated, years earlier. But off in the distance of this photograph, I don't know if you can see my cursor. There's a train, an elevated train station in the background. And this is a great photograph because you can see both the train station and the bus station. And as I mentioned in the first wave of the Great Migration, African Americans utilized the train, but because of the development of the highway system, they utilized the bus because it was a lot cheaper, and affordable. And so a lot of people, went by Greyhound. And so my this was my entry point into thinking about mobility, and the journeys of the Great Migration. But my master's thesis at the University of Virginia focused on um, the architecture associated with the Negro Motorist Green Book, and I compared it to architecture associated with the Underground Railroad. And I was really interested in these places that African Americans used, navigated through during journeys. And when I got to Columbia and started this PhD, thought about those stories that my grandmother would tell me about having to ride in the back of the bus. Um, and riding in the back of the Greyhound bus when she migrated with my mother and my aunt in the early 60s. And so I bought a bus to restore for my dissertation. Um, and this bus is a 1947 Greyhound bus that was converted into an RV in the 70s. So I'm sure you can imagine what that looked like when I purchased it. And so what I'm trying to do is not recreate a house museum on wheels, but what I'm trying to do is move preservation forward in the sense that we look beyond buildings and sites and we look at objects and we look at vehicles and we look at these other things that can shed light on experiences and history. And so I've been deconstructing the bus, the interior of the bus, um, myself, and you can see I'm using a camera from the back of the bus so you can see what African Americans would have seen, their view from the back of the bus. But I'm also using Ray-Ban uh, glasses with cameras so you can see the work that I'm doing on the bus from my perspective. And so that work that I'm doing, again, is for my dissertation. But because my partner lives in Ohio in Cleveland, I decided to bring the bus to Cleveland. And when I did that, the really beautiful thing happened. I, one, got to spend a lot of money on shipping the bus to Cleveland. But when the bus arrived in Cleveland, I people were pulling over in their cars and pedestrians were stopping to ask questions about the bus. Um, and within those questions, I got to ask a question. And one of the questions that I got to ask was, how did your family get to Cleveland or Ohio? Because some people migrated to Ohio and migrated from state or city to city, depending on the job market. And a lot of people said, you know what, I never thought of that. And that was this really incredible moment to see the looks on their faces the first time they thought of their ancestors migrating and how they migrated and what those experiences may have been like. And so I am really excited to share not only my grandmother's story, but I'm excited to share other people's stories through the restoration and preservation of this 1947 Greyhound bus. And um, before I end things, and because I want to open this up to conversations if we can, I want to leave you with this. We've talked about segregation on buses. We've talked about the long journeys that people took on Greyhound buses. But here's an article um, from 1962 where this woman, Mamie Underwood, travels with 10 of her kids and her 1-month-old grandson for 27 hours from Alabama to Cleveland so that they could have a chance. And that speaks volumes to not only the importance of the Great Migration, but it also speaks speaks volumes to the sacrifice and the journey that this woman made so that her kids and grandkid could have a better life. And so I want you guys to just think about that when we think of the Great Migration. Don't just think about the points of departure and the points of arrival, but think about those journeys and the sacrifices that people made to get where they were going. Devin, can we open it up to questions and like have a conversation?
Yes. So if you have questions, you can either type them into the Q&A box, or if you want to actually talk directly, just raise your hand on the hand icon, and I'll turn on your camera as we get them, so you can ask your questions to Robert. But Robert, thanks once again for sharing this story. Can you talk a little bit about ultimately what's going to be happening with the bus?
Yeah, so the buzz, so my dissertation has to be completed in 2 years. And so in the 2 years, like I said, I'll be deconstructing the bus. The deconstruction should end um, by the end of this year. And I've purchased a second bus that has a lot more of the original interior components. And so I'll be switching over those chairs, the seats. I'll be restoring the entire interior completely so it feels like a bus did in 1947. But then there's a digital component that will occur where we're creating, and I've partnered with some folks from the Cleveland Institute of Art, where we're creating an augmented reality so that when people step onto the bus, they'll feel like they're in the 1940s. They'll assume the role of an African American traveler in 1940s, and then they'll have to make a decision whether to sit in the front of the bus or the back of the bus. And depending on that decision, different scenarios will play out. And so this bus will be an exhibition. It's already currently kind of an installation in the back of the Greyhound bus station on Chester right now. But this will be a more activated exhibition that will move throughout the state.
And our next question here, Robert, is could you talk about the partnership between you and Playhouse Square and the excuse me, the Greyhound bus station in Cleveland and why it's so unique and important?
Yeah, so I actually when I brought the bus when I first bought the bus, I had it shipped to my house in Virginia in Fredericksburg, and I didn't tell my family I bought this bus. And so I'm sure you can imagine how surprised they were when it was dropped off in the front yard. Um, and so I was planning on just working on it down there. And when I moved to Cleveland, I had reached out to Mayor Bibbs folks asking if I could potentially rent a hangar at Burke Airport, Lakefront Airport, and we were planning on moving forward with that. And someone from the city had forwarded an email to Craig Hassel, President CEO of Playhouse Square, and he reached out to me, and we had talked about his acquisition or Playhouse's acquisition of the station and what a potential collaboration could look like. And so the rest is kind of history. He invited me to bring the bus to the station, and the bus station is currently active. And so right now they're kind of in a planning phase of figuring out what the bus will become once it's no longer an active bus station. And so figuring out a way to incorporate my work into the station. The bus itself will be a museum. And then the station, and I'm sure you've seen articles written about the station or the potential future plans of the station. Somewhere in this station, we will incorporate the Great Migration and my work and my research and the preservation of the bus.
Thanks. So let's talk a little bit about the experience at the time on the bus. So we answered the first part of Gina's question, but she wants to know on the buses, did they have bathrooms on the buses and were they separate but equal even on the buses?
Yeah, so that's a that's a great question, Gina. So they did not have bathrooms on this bus. And so that's a such a great question. So, no, to answer the first part of your question, no, they did not have bathrooms on the bus. Not until 61, 62 did they start having bathrooms on buses, and that was with the General Motors PD 4104, which was a scenic cruiser, and that was like also designed by Raymond Loewy. Raymond Loewy designed this bus, by the way, streamlined, modern style, which you can see complements the station. There's this architectural aesthetic that happens between the bus and the bus station. And Raymond Loewy also designs the 4104, which was one of the first buses to have a bathroom. So to answer your question, no, this bus did not have bathrooms, but what's really interesting is um, the bus stations or some of the stops that buses made had segregated bathrooms. And so, um, to answer your question, no, the bus did not. And that all often caused problems when black riders or black passengers needed to use the bathroom. Not all places had a colored bathroom. They only had bathrooms for white passengers. And so sometimes black people couldn't get off of the bus because there were no amenities or facilities for them to use. And so the bathrooms, just like restaurants, some stops just didn't accommodate black passengers. And so, um, yeah, thank you for your question.
Kind of going off this a little bit, I know in like several books, they mostly fixate on the train travel and how once you hit the Mason-Dixon line, black passengers, once they hit the south, had to move to the back. And going north, where I think the opportunity to, escape from the prejudices a little bit on the bus. Did you find anything about people, willingly moving forward in the bus once they got out of the South? And, from what my understanding was from many books that have covered this topic is people even were terrified because they came from the South to do that, but occasionally people would. Did you find anything like that in your research?
They were so yeah, two things happened. So they were one terrified because they were used to the social norms of the South. But those social norms also happened in the North. You know, it's a myth that once you crossed this invisible line entering the North or
Yeah.
the Midwest, that racism is no longer here. It just wasn't as overt in these major cities. And there's evidence that these things still occurred where um, even in New York City, there's an example of in New York City where an African American man is told to move to the back of the bus and he refuses, and the police come and they shoot him and he dies. This is New York City, you know, in the 60s, in the early 60s. And so people are still afraid to move forward in the front of these buses. But there's also cases where African Americans um, can't even get tickets to certain places, or there's no seats available. And so that social hierarchy is still playing out in the North and in these cities. It's just not as overt.
And Gina sharing a comment here. In Cincinnati, when the soldiers traveled from the north to the south by train, they could not go into Union Terminal in Cincinnati to buy a sandwich, so they would give white soldiers money to buy them sandwiches. And most of the time, the soldiers did not come back. because Cincinnati was their stop. Uh, so it's referring to the white soldiers there. In fact, when the train crossed the Ohio into Kentucky, black soldiers were forced to go to the back of the train. So, pervasive, institutionalization of the racism, even
Yeah,
once you hit the North.
yeah, yeah. But also thinking about the almost the interracial friendships and bonds that are formed on these buses, when you think of, we were just talking about the train, the train was a lot more expensive than taking the bus. Um, and there's a different class associated with train travel. But everyone on the bus is working class, pretty much working class or a soldier or someone that's looking for an affordable means of transportation. And just thinking about the person right that's sitting right behind you, you think you're better than them just because of your race, and you're on the same level, the same class is crazy. And there's some cases where black and white people would have conversations, and you're on the bus for hours at a time. You're having these types of conversations, and that would bother some white drivers, and so they would try to break that up, say you can't sit here or you can't talk, or you know, you have to sit 2 rows behind the last white person on this bus.
And could you talk a little bit more about the kind of the preparation necessary, even beyond saving money, obviously, to get a bus ticket or a train ticket that people had to endure? I'm thinking of topics, situations like, the fact that you weren't, in some cases, the deeper into the South you weren't willingly allowed to travel. You didn't have that freedom. You kind of really did have to escape.
Yeah. Yeah, so there's a number of reasons why people left, right? And usually we hear to for better opportunities, and I often say, well, specifically, what is that better opportunity? Because it differs for everyone, right? It could be um, a better opportunity. I'm looking for a job. I've got kids. I want them to have a better education. I want access to certain things. I want to be closer to relatives who migrated. Or I got into something in the South and now I need to get out before I lose my life. I am escaping danger right now. And so, one, you have to save up. And that's either you're saving up or your church is saving up or your relatives are saving up, or even the relatives who migrated now are doing better. They've experienced upward mobility. They're in a position where they can send you money to come stay with them for a bit. But even in the last case that where I ended about Mamie Lee Underwood, she was promised a lie by white racists. And this happens throughout the South during this time, where these groups of white racists would go into black communities and say, we'll give you a bus ticket. You'll give you and your family a bus ticket. There's a whole network of people waiting for you in this big city. They'll give you a house, they'll give you a job, they'll give you all of these things. They'll promise them the world. And then once they put them on the bus, and even sometimes the train, the person would get there and realize that that was all a lie. That was just those racists' way of getting these black people out of the South. And so, people migrate for so many different reasons, and they get to these cities for in so many different ways. And sometimes they even have to pay that money back. They would write letters to employers in these cities. If you send me money, I promise the first two checks will be yours. I'll work for free for the first month or so. It's the bartering system, any way to get to where you need to go to start this life. And thinking about the amount of sacrifice and the things that these people put up. Some people sold their homes, some people sold their furniture to afford these tickets. Think about all of that that they're sacrificing to get to a place to start all over again. It's huge.
All right. Our next question, getting you back in the preservation mindset here. How do you imagine preservation practice expanding to include vehicles beyond the traditional sites, buildings, and structures?
I mean, I've worked in several house museums, Monticello, Pope Leahy House, Woodlawn, and Appomattox Courthouse. A house museum is great. A historic house is great. Preserving a building, a site is great. Um, Erecting a historical marker is great, but it tends to freeze things in moment spaces and time. And I think about my childhood and how it was so mobile. My family and I, we gather around the table, for holidays and sometimes Sundays, but every day, almost every week, almost every day, we would gather within a vehicle because we were driving to church, we were driving to school, we were driving to grocery shopping, errands, and road trips back to Fredericksburg, from New York to Fredericksburg. And I think about all of the experiences, all of the laughs, all of the conversations, viewing architecture, viewing landscapes, viewing those sites that I experienced and that I saw and witnessed from the back seat of a car with my grandmother, my mother and aunt in the front seat. And just thinking about collectively as a country, as a society, all of the moments that we're missing by not preserving vehicles, more vehicles that tell our stories. There is the National um, Historic Vehicles Register that selects very few cars that are associated with icons and stars of history. And I'm very interested in preserving and representing the everyday experience of people, of everyday people. We can all think about the smell of the car that we would ride in when we were a child. We know what the chairs look like. We know what music was playing and what that felt like when our parents are driving, the bumps, where you sat in the car. Was it on the hump in the center, or was it a window seat, and then the first time you learned to drive, we all experience these moments in cars, but we're so disconnected to the history of cars, and we tend to just focus on buildings and sites and preservation. This is the very first time a moving object, especially a mode of transportation, has even been talked about in the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation at Columbia, and I'm happy to do it.
So let's talk a little bit more about the ultimate outcomes of this project. So when this bus is restored and it's installed at the Greyhound station, first, how do you anticipate that the general public is going to be engaging with it? And also, what do you hope they experience and learn from the experience you're creating for them?
Yeah, I'm gonna try not to get emotional, but this 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 project started off as being a dissertation project, and over time it has leveled out to be simply a letter to my grandmother, me asking her questions through the bus. And when the people who saw the bus arrive in Cleveland started having those conversations with me and asking me questions, and I threw the questions back at them. And every day when I'm downtown working on the bus, and people ask me, or say to me, I never thought about how my relative got to Cleveland or got to whatever city. And some people even know that history or know that story. My grandmother or my great grandmother traveled on Monday at 3 o'clock, and they know all of the details. And that's what I'm realizing, that's the moments that I'm looking for. That's the outcome. The bus is already doing the thing that I want it to do without even activating it. It's creating those conversations about talking about history. It's talking about experiences, travel experiences. It's talking about architecture. We just in this conversation alone, we've already talked about Raymond Loewy. We've talked about art, architecture, migration, racism, segregation. And we're having a more inclusive conversation about traveling, about the dynamics of our society, urbanism. Why are people even leaving the South? There's a reason behind that, and that's a whole other dissertation. Um, and urbanism and the urbanization of cities and industry. What industries are pulling this labor force out of the South? And how does all of this relate to what's happening today? Greyhound is no longer what it used to be, and people are still migrating by bus. We're losing um, bus stations, and that history is kind of fading out. And so this is my way of also remembering Greyhound for what it used to be. It had a lot of challenges in its history. It did a lot of bad things to black people, but it also provided a means to express that freedom. There's a Greyhound bus museum in Hibbing, Minnesota that does not talk about um culture. It does not talk about the black experience. Um and so this is also a way to kind of push up against that. There's a Freedom Rides Museum, which is also in an old bus station, Greyhound bus station, and they've restored a Greyhound, a 1957 um, Greyhound bus. But that they just focus on one chapter in history, and that's the 1961 Freedom Rides. And ironically enough, Fredericksburg, Virginia, where my grandmother left, um, was the first stop. That bus depot that I showed in my presentation, that was the first stop of the 1961 Freedom Riders once they left Washington, D.C. And that bus station, that bus depot in Fredericksburg, Virginia, is no longer standing. But there's a historical marker there. And so we tend to preserve the spaces and these sites, but I want us to think a little more about the moments in between these places and sites.
Sounds great, Robert. All right, I'm not seeing any more questions, so if you have any questions, please type those in or raise your hand in the audience. So, Robert, I'll ask you a question. When can we visit, and what are you going to do after you finish this?
Well, I invite everyone to come down any day of the week or shoot me an email and schedule something. I'm always downtown working on the bus unless something else is coming up. Um so I invite you guys to come down and just see the process and see the work happen as it's happening. Um but next year, by this time next year, it should be an open exhibition installation. We'll be activating temporary installations throughout the building by then. So you'll be able to experience the space in some capacity, but you'll definitely be able to experience the bus, and we'll try to get it moving and around the city, the state, so other people can experience it as well.
Beautiful. All right, Robert. I don't see any more questions. Before we go, in case anyone missed it earlier, I'm going to re-put into the chat box the AIA sign up link here as well. And once again, I just like to thank Robert for doing this amazing presentation today. When I was emailing back and forth with him, I was telling him how disappointed I always am at conferences that I don't get to see a lot of sessions because I'm doing things in the background. I was really disappointed to miss his presentation at our conference this year, but glad I got to come to this one today. It was really wonderful. And so, Robert, once again, thanks again from Heritage, Ohio for putting this together, and we can't wait to see this bus.
Thank you.
Any final comments from you before we go?
No, I'm just super happy to excited to be in Ohio doing this type of work. Ohio, as a New Yorker, I came here thinking New York was the best, but I'm starting to think differently. Especially getting to know the preservation community and the landscape of historical buildings and objects and things around the state. So I'm just glad to be here.
We're glad to have you. And once again, thanks for putting this together and can't wait to see it. We'll see you at our next webinar, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.